The Merrick place lay 11 miles beyond the last town Ruth Calder had tried, and she'd walked most of it on the strength of a single sentence a storekeeper had let slip: that a widower out past Sage Creek still hadn't found anyone to see his flock through lambing. She found him at the pen rail, counting ewes against the notches on a tally stick, and didn't wait for him to speak first. "I heard you needed a hand for lambing," she said. Hosea Merrick looked her over the way he looked over new stock, plainly, without unkindness, but without haste either. "Last man I hired left after 4 days. Man before that broke a ewe's leg trying to catch her wrong." "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Ruth said. "Watch me work a week. If I'm no good to you, I'll walk on and you'll owe me nothing." "You've kept sheep before?" "My family ran a small flock in Nebraska before my father went to the mines. I know lambing. I know how to turn a ewe without wrenching her legs. And I know when one's off her feed before she shows it plain." She didn't say the rest, that her father had died in a shaft collapse that spring, that there was no flock left to go back to, that a week's trial was the only offer she'd gotten in 3 towns. Hosea's eyes went past her, briefly, to the small girl crouched at the far rail, 7 years old, watching the exchange with an attention that missed nothing and answered nothing aloud. "My daughter's deaf," he said, plain, testing whether it would trouble her. "Doesn't speak much either, watches things instead." "Then she'll see soon enough whether I'm worth keeping." He didn't answer that right away. He looked at the girl instead, some question passing between them that needed no words at all. The girl didn't nod. She simply climbed down from the rail and crossed the yard, stopping a careful arm's length from Ruth. Hosea watched her cross that distance, and for the first time since Ruth arrived, his expression changed. "Pens this way," he said. "We'll see what a week tells us." A week would be enough to earn Ruth a place with the flock. It would take considerably longer to learn what one wrong judgment could cost it. Sometimes trust doesn't come from the person with the most to lose. Sometimes it comes first from the one who's learned to watch most carefully. A child who trusts through her eyes what the adults around her still have to prove through their hands. If stories about quiet trust and hard-earned skill on the American frontier speak to you, subscribe and walk this season with Ruth, Hosea, and Nettie. Hosea didn't waste the first morning on words. He walked Ruth to the lambing pen, handed her nothing, and told her to watch a ewe that had been circling and pawing at the straw since before dawn. "Tell me what you see," he said. Ruth watched the ewe a long moment, the way she kept lying down and rising again, the way her flanks tightened and released. "She's close." "Not tonight close, maybe by evening." "How do you know she's not closer than that?" "Because she's still eating between spells. One that's hours off won't touch feed at all." Hosea said nothing to that, which she was already learning was the closest thing he gave to agreement. He turned and went to check the next pen, and left her there. By midday, she'd sorted through the near flock on her own initiative, running a hand down each foreleg, checking for the heat and swelling that meant foot rot starting, turning up hooves crusted with mud to see the horn beneath. She found one ewe favoring a hind leg, and worked the hoof clean with a knife borrowed from the tool shed, paring back the overgrown edge until the animal stood square again. She didn't ask permission first. She asked forgiveness after, showing Hosea the hoof and the shaving of horn still curled in her palm. "Should have asked before you took a blade to my stock," he said. "You'd have told me to check it myself either way." He looked at her a moment, and something almost like the start of a smile crossed his face before he put it away. "Next time, ask anyhow." Nettie had been at the fence rail the whole while, close enough to watch everything and far enough that no one thought to send her off. She'd taken to following Ruth at a fixed distance, never quite beside her, never quite behind, the way a person tests the depth of water with one foot before committing the other. On the 3rd day, the ewe Ruth had marked as close finally went down properly into labor, and it went wrong almost at once. The lamb's forelegs came first, which was right, but the head stayed tucked back against its chest, which was not. Ruth had seen this once before, years ago, her father's hand guiding hers the same way she now had to guide her own. "Get Hosea," she told Nettie. then remembered and pointed instead toward the house, toward the barn, any direction that meant now, and Nettie was already running. By the time Hosea reached the pen, Ruth had her arm into the elbow, easing the head forward the way her father had shown her, one finger hooked to bring the chin up and clear. It came free all at once, the way these things did, no warning between struggle and release. The lamb lay still a moment too long on the straw, and Ruth cleared its mouth and nose with 2 fingers and rubbed hard along its ribs until it startled a breath into itself and let out a thin, furious cry. Hosea crouched down beside her and said nothing about the arm she still had bloodied to the elbow, nothing about the risk she'd taken reaching in without waiting for him. He only watched the lamb find its feet, unsteady, butting blind against its mother's flank for the first pull of milk. "You've done that before," he said. "Once. My father's hands, mostly, mine just following his." Didn't look like following today. He didn't offer more praise than that, and she didn't ask for it. But that evening, without being told to, he set a 3rd plate at the table where before there had been 2 set out and a 3rd handed to her separately at the stove. A small thing, the kind of thing that meant nothing on its own, and everything stacked against everything else he hadn't said. Nettie noticed it before Ruth did. She noticed most things before anyone said them aloud. She'd taken to sitting close enough at supper now that her shoulder nearly touched Ruth's, and that night she reached over without ceremony and moved Ruth's fork half an inch, squaring it against the plate the way she squared her own. A small, wordless insistence that things be done a particular way, and that Ruth was now someone worth correcting. Ruth left it exactly where Nettie had placed it. Outside, past the near pasture, the creek that fed both the Merrick place and the Moss Ranch upstream ran high and easy with spring melt, the kind of easy that never lasted past June, though none of them were thinking of that yet. There was lambing still ahead of them, weeks of it, 1 ewe at a time, and for now, that was trouble enough to fill a season. The weather turned reliably warm in the 2nd week of May, and Hosea judged it enough. "Sheared too soon, they take a chill, and you lose more to sickness than the wool was worth," he told Ruth, the closest he'd come yet to explaining a decision before making it. "Wait till the ground itself has warmed, not just the air." They set up in the shearing pen on a still morning. Hand shears sharpened the night before on a stone Ruth had found herself and asked permission to use. Hosea worked the first few animals to show her the motion. Long, even strokes following the lay of the fleece, keeping the shears close along the skin without letting the points catch a fold at the belly or legs where a nick could open a wound that flies would find within the hour. Ruth took the shears for the 4th ewe. Her first pass ran too shallow, leaving a ragged strip of half-cut wool, and she had to go back over it, slower, feeling the give of the blade against fleece rather than watching for it. By the 10th animal, her hands had found the rhythm her father's flock had once taught her years before, and by the 20th, Hosea had stopped watching her work at all, occupied instead with rolling and tying the fleeces she'd already taken. "You're faster than the man before you," he said, not looking up from the tie he was knotting. "He broke a ewe's leg." "He did. You're also not doing that." It was for Hosea something close to a compliment, and Ruth had learned enough of him in a month to take it as one. Nettie's job through shearing was the drafting gate, swinging it shut on Hosea's hand signal to sort each ewe into the right holding pen the instant she was sheared. A task that asked for quick eyes rather than strength. She matched every animal to its pen without being told twice, kept her own tally in her head of which ewes had passed through and which hadn't, and once caught an error before either adult did, pulling at Ruth's sleeve to point out a ewe drifting back toward the gate a 2nd time, fleece already gone from her the day before. It was during the 3rd week of shearing that Ruth first asked Hosea to trust her judgment outright, rather than simply not correcting it after the fact. A stretch of the near pasture had gone thin and pale, where the flock grazed it hardest, and Ruth wanted to move the whole band north a week earlier than Hosea had planned, before the ground wore through to bare dirt. "I had it marked for the 25th, Hosea said. "Ground can't wait that long. It's already showing through in patches by the fence line." He didn't go look for himself. That was the part Ruth noticed, That a month earlier he would have walked out to see it with his own eyes before deciding anything. And this time he only asked her one more question, about how far the bare patches had spread, and then nodded once. "Move them Thursday," he said. It was a small thing, moving a date by 4 days. It was also the first time he'd taken her word for something he hadn't seen himself, and Ruth understood, walking back to the pen afterward, that this had cost him something to give. The same way the third plate at supper had cost him something, small and unspoken and impossible to take back once given. Near the end of shearing, working through the last dozen ewes, Ruth noticed one hanging back from the others, rubbing her flank hard against a fence post before Ruth caught her for shearing. Beneath the fleece, the skin showed faint redness and a scattering of dry, flaking crust, no worse than what Ruth remembered from a mild lice outbreak in her father's flock years before. A nuisance, treatable, nothing that had ever cost them an animal. She made a note to watch the ewe over the coming days, sheared her same as the rest, and moved on to the next. She did not mention it to Hosea. There seemed, that evening, nothing yet worth the words. For a week after shearing, the ewe Ruth had marked seemed no worse. The redness beneath the fleece paled to something Ruth could almost convince herself was healing rather than merely resting, and she watched it the way she'd watch anything she judged minor, closely but without alarm. She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't understand how wrong for several more days yet. What she hadn't accounted for was the holding pen itself, the same crowded enclosure every sheared ewe had passed through in turn that week. Clean animals pressed flank to flank against ones she hadn't yet flagged as anything worth separating. Whatever moved between fleece and skin didn't need much room to travel, and a pen built to hold 40 animals close together for an afternoon gave it exactly the room it needed. It was Nettie who found the second one. Ruth was mending a gate latch near the far pen when she felt a tug at her sleeve and turned to find the girl pointing, insistent, toward a ewe near the water trough, rubbing her side hard against the rail. Again and again, the same motion Ruth had seen once before and dismissed as nothing worth mentioning. Ruth caught the ewe and parted the fleece at the shoulder. The skin beneath was worse than the first one had ever been, raw in patches, crusted thick along one flank, wool coming away in her hand where it should have held fast. This was not the mild, forgettable irritation she remembered from her father's flock. She understood, kneeling there with a fistful of loosened wool, that she'd been looking at the wrong thing from the start, and that the resemblance between two different problems had cost her the only week when catching it early might have mattered. She found Hosea at the tool shed and told him plainly, without softening it. He walked back with her without a word, checked the second ewe himself, then began working through the flock pen by pen, parting fleece, checking skin, marking each affected animal with a daub of tar along the spine so it could be told from the rest at a glance. By the time he'd finished, the mark showed on 14. "How long have you known?" he asked, not raising his voice, which somehow made it land harder than if he had. "I saw the first one during shearing. I thought it was lice. I've seen that before, in my father's flock. It never spread past 2 or 3 animals in a season, never needed more than watching." "This isn't lice. I know that now." He didn't say anything else about it that evening, and that silence was its own kind of answer. The next morning, he laid out the day's work himself, which pens needed cleaning, which animals needed penning apart from the rest, which chores were hers, and which he'd see to personally, the way he had that first week, before he'd started leaving decisions to her without comment. He didn't say he no longer trusted her judgment. He simply stopped asking for it, and Ruth understood, watching him work the list out loud rather than letting her make it, exactly how much ground she'd lost. Nettie seemed to understand something of it too, though no one had explained it to her in words she could hear. She took to standing nearer Ruth than usual over the following days, matching her step for step between pens, and once, catching Ruth staring too long at nothing while mixing a bucket of wash water, reached up and tapped her arm twice. Not urgent, just present, the way a person reminds another that they're still there. That night, alone in the room off the kitchen, Ruth turned the mistake over the way she'd once watched her father turn over bad seasons on the old flock, looking for the moment it might have gone differently, and not finding one that didn't run straight back to her own certainty that she already knew what she was looking at. She had known enough to be trusted with the flock. She had not, it turned out, known enough to be trusted with everything in it. Treatment for scab followed no shortcut Ruth knew of, and Hosea explained the whole of it before they began, the same flat, unhurried way he explained anything he expected her to do right the first time. The 14 mark ewes went into a separate pen at the far end of the property, well clear of the rest of the flock, with their own trough and their own gate that stayed shut except when someone was inside it. Hosea and Ruth spent the better part of a day building a dipping trough from planed boards with the seams sealed in pitch, long enough for a ewe to stand chest deep in it, narrow enough that 2 people could hold her steady the length of it. Hosea mixed the dip himself the first time, tobacco leaf steeped down to a dark, bitter liquor. Sulfur worked into it until the mixture turned the color of wet ash, and showed Ruth how strong the trough could be filled before it did more harm than the mange itself. "Too weak, you're just giving the mites a bath they'll shake off," he said. "Too strong, you'll blister hide worse than the scab ever would." They worked the 14 through the trough one at a time, holding each ewe down to the neck in the mixture for a slow count Hosea kept under his breath, working the liquor in by hand around the ears and face where the trough alone couldn't reach without risking the animal's eyes. It was slow, foul-smelling work, and by the 4th ewe, Ruth's hands had gone raw at the knuckles from the sulfur, and by the 10th her back ached in a way that had nothing to do with any single motion and everything to do with all of them repeated. Hosea worked beside her the whole time, not because he no longer trusted her hands, but because holding a full-grown ewe steady in a trough took 2 people, and there was no sense pretending otherwise. He didn't talk while they worked, but he corrected her twice, once for letting a ewe's head duck too low in the mixture, once for pulling one clear before the count had finished, and both times she fixed it without argument, and he moved on without comment. They didn't stop at the 14. Every ewe in the flock had stood flank to flank with the marked ones at some point during shearing week, and Hosea judged the whole band exposed enough to be worth a precautionary pass through the trough as well, along with a morning spent scrubbing down the rails and fence posts the affected animals had spent a week rubbing against. 12 or 14 days, we do 'em all again, he told her, toweling off his hands after the last ewe. One dippin' won't finish it. By then, whatever this first bath missed in the egg will be out where the second one can reach it. Ruth understood, hearing that the mistake wasn't a single afternoon's problem to be solved and set aside. It was going to take the better part of a month to close in the same patient, unglamorous increments as everything else on the place. She spent the days between dippings checking the 14 twice daily, morning and evening, running a hand through fleece at the worst spots to feel for new heat or new crust, marking in her own memory which animals seemed to be mending and which weren't. She checked the rest of the flock as carefully as the marked ones, working pen by pen for any sign that what the first 14 carried had taken hold elsewhere before anyone knew to watch for it. She found nothing beyond the original 14, though she checked twice to be sure of it, unwilling now to trust a single pass at anything. She also began, without being asked, keeping the marked pen and the clean flock apart in every particular, different water trough filled from a different bucket, different tools for handling each, the gate between them latched every time either of them stepped through it. It was more work than the season strictly demanded. She did it anyway. Hosea noticed, the way he noticed most things, without remarking on it directly. What he did instead, 12 days on, was hand her the mixing of the second dip without standing over her while she did it, walked off to check fence instead, and left her to measure the tobacco and sulfur to the strength he'd shown her the first time, trusting the amount to her memory rather than his own eyes. She got it right. She checked it twice against what she remembered before she trusted it enough to start. By the second dipping, 3 of the 14 had cleared enough that Hosea judged them fit to rejoin the flock. The rest needed watching a while longer. Nettie took to sitting at the rail of the separate pen some evenings, not doing anything in particular. Just present, the way she was present for most things that mattered to the people around her. Watching the marked U's, the same patient way she watched everything else. Ruth didn't ask Hosea when he might trust her with a decision again, the way he had over moving the flock in May. She understood, better now than she had a month before, that trust of that kind wasn't given back all at once, in a single gesture large enough to answer for what had been lost. It came back the way most things on this place seemed to. One correctly measured dip, one properly latched gate, one evening at a time, for as long as it took to be sure. By the middle of July, the last of the 14 had cleared enough of the scab itself that Hosea folded them back into the main flock without ceremony. One gate lifted, and the animals walking through it same as any other morning. 2 of the 14 came back to full condition within days, flesh and coat recovered as if the whole business had barely touched them. The other 12 stayed thinner through the weeks that followed, ribs easier to find beneath the new wool than Ruth liked. The scab cleared from their skin, but the cost of carrying it not yet paid back in full. Ruth watched them all go, counting them by memory the way she'd once watched Nettie count anything that mattered, and said nothing about it to Hosea. There didn't seem by then to be anything left worth saying that the work itself hadn't already said. The rains that usually carried the range through late summer didn't come that year, or came thin and scattered enough not to matter. By the last week of July, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the same water that fed both the Merrick place and the Moss Ranch a mile upstream, had dropped low enough to show gravel bars that hadn't shown themselves in years past, and the near pasture had begun to pale the same way it had in May, only faster now, with no rain behind it to bring it back. Zeke Moss rode down from his own place on the last day of July, not with trouble in his face so much as arithmetic. His cattle needed the creek same as Hosea's sheep did, and there was only so much water coming down from the spring above his land to satisfy both. He and Hosea stood at the fence a long while, working out between them what neither wanted to say outright, that a dry summer meant somebody's stock drank less, and neither man wanted to be the one deciding whose. What they settled on, after most of an hour, was a rough schedule rather than a fight. Zeke would ease his diversion back overnight, letting a fuller flow carry down through the morning to the crossing Hosea's flock used, then open it again for his own cattle around midday, and hold it there through the evening, easing back once more as night came on. It wasn't filed anywhere, wasn't measured, wasn't backed by any decree. It was 2 neighbors agreeing to a hardship neither had caused, trusting the other to hold his half of it, because there was no one else out here to make him. Man could take more than his share, and no one the wiser till the far end ran dry, Hosea said to Ruth that evening, watching the reduced flow work its way down toward the crossing. Zeke's kept his word on water 3 years running, dry summer or wet. That's worth more than paper out here. Ruth understood, hearing that, some of what she hadn't yet learned about a place like this, that the things holding it together weren't always the things written down. It was in early August that Hosea did something he hadn't done since the scab first showed itself. He told Ruth he'd be gone 2 days, riding to Green River for supplies and shearing twine ahead of next season, and left the flock, the whole of it, watering schedule and pasture rotation and all, in her care alone, without a list of instructions written out the way he'd taken to doing since June. "You'll know what wants doing," he said, swinging up onto his horse. "You've known it a while now." It was the first thing close to trust outright he'd offered since the 14 ewes went into their separate pen, and Ruth heard it exactly for what it was. The 2 days passed without incident worth mentioning. The flock watered on schedule, moved once to fresher grass on the second afternoon, counted each evening against the tally she now kept herself rather than relying on Hosea's stick. Nettie stayed close through both days, matching Ruth's rounds pen for pen, and on the second evening, watching the flock settle for the night, reached over and squared Ruth's supper fork against the plate the same small, particular way she'd done it back in April. A gesture that had stopped, sometime in the weeks since, meaning correction, and started meaning something closer to habit shared between two people who trusted each other's ways of doing things. By the time Hosea returned, the creek had dropped another finger's width, and the pale patches in the near pasture had spread wider than either of them liked to look at directly. The schedule with Zeke was holding. The flock was healthy, weakest ewes and all. Neither of them said aloud what both had begun to notice, that a dry summer rewarded patience right up until the day it didn't, and that the day it didn't tended not to announce itself far in advance. The wind came up out of the southwest a little after midday, dry enough that it seemed to pull the moisture straight out of anything it touched, grass, skin, the back of a throat within an hour of standing in it. It wasn't a storm in any way Ruth had learned to recognize one. No cloud built against the horizon, no darkness gathered. Just heat riding hard on moving air, and dust lifting pale off the bare patches in the near pasture, carried low and steady rather than in any driving sheet. Nettie noticed the flock before anyone thought to look at the sky twice. She found Ruth at the tool shed and pulled at her sleeve with more insistence than usual, pointing back toward the pasture. Ruth followed her out and saw it herself once she knew to look. The flock, bunching tighter than the heat alone should have pushed them, backs to the wind, heads turned the same direction rather than scattered loose the way they grazed on an ordinary afternoon. One ewe near the fence had stopped chewing altogether and stood with her head low, ignoring feed a healthy animal wouldn't have passed by. Ruth moved through the flock, checking flanks and breathing the way Hosea had taught her to check for trouble before it announced itself plainly. Most of the band was uncomfortable but sound, panting harder than usual, seeking what shade the fence posts offered. Nothing past what a hot, dry wind would account for in any ordinary year. The dozen ewes that had carried scab through June were a different matter. Ruth found them clustered apart from the rest, breathing faster than the heat alone explained, two of them down in the dust rather than standing. She ran a hand along their flanks and felt the same shallow, quickened breath in each one, bodies that had spent a month fighting off might and dip and were only now, weeks later, catching up to the cost of it. Reserves thinner than the rest of the flocks, margins narrower. A hot wind finding the weakness the treatment had left behind, long after the treatment itself was finished. She found Hosea checking the fence line and told him plainly what she'd found. "How long till they're due water?" he asked, already moving toward the pasture. "Not till morning. It's Zeke's turn on the creek till evening, same as always, and after that it's still the better part of a night before the flow eases back to us." Hosea crouched by the weakest of the two down ewes and felt what Ruth had already felt, the fast, shallow breathing, the dry gum beneath the lip. "They've been through worse and come out the other side," he said, though it sounded, even to him, like a hope rather than a certainty. "Not in this kind of heat, not with their condition still down from June. I don't think they've got until morning in them, maybe not until evening." He was quiet a moment, turning the same arithmetic Ruth had already turned twice on her way to find him. Breaking the schedule meant driving the whole flock, sound and weak together, no sense separating them under a wind like this, down to the crossing during the hours Zeke held the diversion for his own cattle. It meant showing up at a fence line that had held for 3 dry summers on nothing but 2 men trusting each other's word and asking that word to bend. 3 years he's kept that schedule without once taking more than his share, Hosea said. "I break it once, even for good reason. Next dry summer he's got cause to wonder if I'll break it again. And if we wait, and we lose 2 or 3 of them to a wind that didn't need to cost us anything. I know what waiting costs too." He said it without heat, the way he said most things, but there was something in it Ruth hadn't heard from him before. Not certainty, but the absence of it. A decision he didn't yet have the shape of. He looked at the flock a long moment, then at Ruth. "You've watched them closer than I have these past weeks. Your call. Which way?" It was, Ruth understood, exactly what she'd spent since June trying to earn back. Not forgiveness spoken aloud, but a decision handed to her plainly in a moment that mattered as much as any that had come before it. "We move them now," she said. "Ask Zeke first if there's time, and if there isn't, move them anyway and settle it with him after. I'd rather explain a broken schedule to a neighbor than explain 2 dead ewes to no one at all." Hosea held her eye a moment, then nodded once, the same economical motion he used for anything he'd decided to stand behind. "Get Nettie to help push the sound ones. I'll carry the weak two myself if they won't walk it." They moved the flock inside the hour, the wind still dry and steady behind them, dust rising thin off the trail toward a crossing that, for 3 years, had never once seen sheep on cattle's time. Zeke Moss was at the diversion himself when the flock came down toward the crossing, checking the head gate the way he did most afternoons of a dry summer, and he saw them coming a good distance off, too far off to mistake for anything but what they were, sheep moving toward water on cattle's time. He didn't shout, and he didn't move to close the gate against them. He stood where he was and waited for Hosea to reach him, which Hosea did on foot, leaving Ruth and Nettie to hold the flock back a stone's throw from the bank until there was something settled to move them into. "Wasn't expecting your band down here at this hour," Zeke said. Not an accusation, a plain observation, the kind a man made when he already knew the answer, had to be a poor one, and wanted to hear it said rather than guess at it. "Wouldn't have brought them if I'd had a choice in it," Hosea said. He told it straight, the scab in June, the dip, the dozen ewes still paying the cost of both weeks after the treatment had finished, and now a dry wind finding exactly the weakness that history had left in them. "2 were down in the pasture before we moved. I judged they wouldn't hold till the water came back to us in the morning." Zeke looked past him to where Ruth stood with the flock, then back to Hosea. "That her judgment, or yours?" "Hers. She's watched them closer than I have these past weeks." It would have been easy, Ruth thought, watching from where she stood, for Zeke to make something ugly of that, a woman's word overriding an arrangement 2 men had built. He didn't. He only turned it over the way he turned over most things, slow and without heat, the same way Hosea did. 3 years we've kept to our share, Zeke said finally. Kept to it because neither one of us took more than the other could afford to give up. First time it bends because you needed it to. I can live with that. Once. I don't know yet what it costs the both of us come next dry summer, when maybe it's my herd standing where your flock's standing now. Then we work that out plain when it comes, Hosea said. I'm not asking you to forget it happened. I'm asking you to let them drink today. Zeke held the gate a moment longer, some private calculation working behind his eyes, then stepped back from it. Water them. We'll talk terms after, when there's less at stake in the talking. The flock went down to the bank in a loose, thirsty rush. The 2 weakest ewes half carried the last stretch by Hosea and pushed gently into the shallows where they could drink without struggling to stand for it. Ruth stayed close to those 2, one hand on each flank, feeling the shudder of relief pass through them as they finally took water, longer and deeper than any of the sound animals around them. Nettie worked the edges of the flock the way she always did, keeping strays from wandering too far downstream, and once, catching sight of the 2 weak ewes finally lifting their heads clear-eyed rather than glazed with heat, reached over and took Ruth's free hand without being asked, holding it a moment, before letting go and going back to her work. They stayed at the crossing longer than usual, letting every animal drink its fill twice over, rather than risk the walk back with any of them still wanting. By the time they turned the flock for home, the wind had begun to lose its edge, same slow fading Ruth remembered from other dry spells. Dust settling rather than lifting as the worst of the heat went out of the day. Zeke didn't ride down to talk terms that evening. He came 3 days later instead, once the wind was well and truly past, and there was nothing left in the air to make hard words harder. What he and Hosea settled on, standing at the same fence where they'd worked out the original schedule back in July, moved the midday changeover 2 hours earlier than before, giving Zeke's cattle a longer claim on the afternoon flow and leaving Hosea's flock 2 hours less time at the morning crossing than the understanding they'd relied on for 3 years. Fair, given what happened, Hosea told Ruth afterward, though his voice carried none of the ease it might have carried over a fairer bargain. Might not hold as easy next dry year, but it holds now. Ruth understood, hearing that, the shape of what she'd traded that afternoon at the crossing. the flock alive and drinking, against a season's worth of goodwill spent down to less than what it had been, with no clean way yet to know what it would cost either of them when the next hard summer came looking for it. The wind that had driven them to the crossing was the last hard weather of that dry summer, though none of them knew it for certain until the season had turned enough to look back and be sure. September came in cooler, with rain enough by the middle of the month to green the near pasture back from the pale, thinned state it had worn since July. The dozen ewes that had carried scab, and then the wind, stayed thin longer than the rest of the flock. 2 came back to full condition within a few weeks of steadier grazing. The others took the better part of the month, gaining weight slowly. One of them, an older ewe Nettie had taken to watching most closely of all, for no reason either adult could name, never quite closing the gap the summer had opened in her. She lived. She simply carried less flesh into autumn than a ewe her age should have, and would likely carry a lighter lamb in spring for it. The kind of cost that didn't announce itself all at once, but settled in for good, the same way the narrower water schedule with Zeke had settled in. Hosea rode to the Moss place twice more before the month was out, not to renegotiate what they'd settled at the fence, but to help Zeke shore up a stretch of the diversion that had started leaking through the dry months. An hour or 2 of work each time, given without being asked for, the kind of thing that didn't undo a debt so much as sit alongside it. Zeke never brought up the crossing again directly. He didn't need to. The 2 hours shaved off Hosea's turn at the water sat between them plainly enough that naming it again would only have made it larger. Ruth kept her own count of the flock through it all, same as she had since August, checking the tally against her memory each evening rather than waiting to be asked. Hosea stopped checking her figures against his own sometime in early September, though neither of them marked the exact day it happened. It simply stopped being a thing he did, the way it had simply started being a thing he did back in June. Late in the month, mending a gate hinge that had worked loose over the summer, Hosea said the closest thing to a full accounting either of them offered the other. "You cost this place a scab outbreak in June," he said, not looking up from the hinge. "You're also the reason I've got a full count of ewes instead of 2 or 3 fewer. We paid for that second part in water, 2 hours less than we had every day for as long as this dry spell holds. That's the whole of it, plain. Not just the half that favors you." "Both true," Ruth said. "Didn't say it to make you feel one way or the other about it. Just seemed like something that ought to be said plain once instead of left sitting." He finished the hinge and tested the gate, swinging it once to be sure it caught clean. Nettie had come to lean against the fence post nearby, watching the 2 of them the way she watched most things that mattered, and when Hosea straightened up from the gate, she reached over and took his hand, the same unceremonious way she'd once taken Ruth's at the crossing. Not asking anything of the moment, just present inside it. Ruth thought, watching that, of the first evening she'd arrived, the girl climbing down from the rail to close a careful arm's length of distance that had meant more than either adult had known how to say at the time. The distance was smaller now, between all 3 of them, though none of it had closed through any single grand gesture. It had closed the way the flock's trust in her had rebuilt itself after June, one correctly measured dip, one properly latched gate, one evening at a time, until there was simply more good ground between them than bad. The breeding flock went into October at 161 ewes, the same count it had carried since spring. The season's lamb crop tallied separately, weaned and thriving on their own, no losses charged against the summer, beyond what the dry months and one hard wind had cost in condition rather than lives. The water schedule with the Moss place held at its new, narrower terms, untested yet by another dry year, its true cost still owed rather than paid in full. Ruth didn't know, watching the flock settle into the first cool evenings of autumn, whether the arrangement would hold the next time Drought pushed 2 neighbors toward the same thin stretch of creek. She knew only what the season itself had taught her plainly enough, that a place like this didn't reward getting everything right. It rewarded staying long enough and working carefully enough to be trusted with the next mistake before it happened, and the one after that. Before we leave the Merrick place, consider the moment Hosea turned to Ruth at the fence and asked which way to go. Weeks earlier, her judgment had cost him 14 sick ewes. Now, with the flock's weakest animals failing in the heat, he handed the decision back to the same person who'd gotten it wrong before. Not because the risk was smaller, but because she'd spent a month proving, one small task at a time, that a single mistake wasn't the whole measure of her. Would you have trusted her again that quickly? Or would you have kept the decision for yourself, no matter how much ground she'd made up since June? My own view is that trust rebuilt after a real mistake is worth more than trust that was never tested at all. Hosea wasn't betting on Ruth being right. He was betting on what a month of careful, unglamorous work had already told him about her. Tell us what you think. Did Hosea hand that decision back too soon, or exactly when he should have? Please leave your thoughts, criticism, and suggestions in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, like the video and subscribe to Wild West Life. Your feedback helps us make every new story stronger.